Good Yantiv. As I mentioned on Rosh Hashanah, and as we are well aware, this last year has been tremendously painful for our people. Since the attack on October 7th, our congregation and our Jewish community have come together to support one another and to support Israel. Our congregation hosted the community vigil just days after the attack, and earlier this week, we hosted the community's commemoration. We have given to the Federation's campaign to help bring healing to our siblings in Israel. We have listened as Israelis have shared their experiences with us. We have made trips to Israel to volunteer and to show our support. And we have said prayers for Israel every single day. Beginning the Shabbat after the attack, we began a new practice at Adath, Israel. Every Shabbat, following the prayer for our country and the prayer for Israel, we have sung Hatikvah. Today, I would like to speak about the practice of singing Hatikvah during services. As you know, Hatikvah is the national anthem of Israel, and it would certainly be possible for someone to ask the question, should national anthems be part of a service? Furthermore, while we do say prayers for both our country and for Israel, we have not sung the Star Spangled Banner during services. So why would we sing Hatikvah? Today, I would like to reflect upon these questions. But first, let's review the translation of Hatikvah. As long as deep within the heart, the soul of the Jew yearns, to the east, the eye looks to Zion. Our hope is not yet lost. The hope of 2,000 years, people in our land, the land of Zion and Jerusalem. What is the hope? Liot am chofshi be'artzenu, to be a free people in our land. The hope has two parts. One, being in our land, and two, being free. Several years ago on the high holidays, I emphasized the importance of our being in our land, the importance of our kesher, our connection with our homeland. I shared about the numerous connections that archaeology has unearthed, from the Dead Sea Scrolls to the two tiny silver scrolls featuring the priestly blessing, to the life-saving tunnel of King Hezekiah. The Tanakh and our people's history come alive within the land of Israel. I spoke about how Hebrew, our language, connects us through the generations, from the writings of our ancestors in Eretz Yisrael to the prayers that our children chant here at Adath Israel today. I shared about our genetic connection to those who lived in Zion long ago and how our people have always had a presence in the land. I reminisced about the vision of our prophets so long ago who foretold that our people scattered across the world would one day return to Zion. And I shared how grateful I am that after thousands of years of longing, heartache, and prayers, our people have indeed returned to our homeland. Im tirtzu zalo agada, if you will it, it is no dream. In spite of others' attempts to make Zionism an offensive term, Zionism is simply the belief that we have a right, like any people, to live in our homeland, and I am proud to be a Zionist. Before, when I spoke with you, I highlighted our connection to our homeland. But this year, I need to highlight that other critical element of Hatikvah, Liot am chofshi, to be a free people in our land. Like many of you, during this past year, my heart has been torn. That phrase, Liot am chofshi, to be a free people, continues to rise up in my mind. The need for freedom fills my heart and my prayers. Our people's freedom has always been important to me, but I didn't focus on it like I do now. Why? In a word, privilege. The concept of privilege has been highlighted over the past number of years. It is important for us to become aware of privilege. What privileges have we been blessed with? What privileges do we take for granted? What privileges do others not have? A little background about me. I was born in the 70s in the United States of America. I grew up during a time and in a place where I could be out and proud of my Judaism. I didn't face the anti-Semitism that my grandparents experienced. I never saw what my papa saw when he immigrated to America from the land of his birth, the land of Israel. My papa told me of the anti-Semitic signs he saw displaying the words, "No dogs or Jews allowed at the beach." He told me of the fights people started with him just because he was a Jewish greenhorn. I didn't need to go through any of that. And over this past year, I've become more aware of my privilege as an American Jew, growing up when I did, and in areas with little explicit anti-Semitism. I, of course, heard the stories of our oppression, the terrible attacks of the Middle Ages, the pogroms of Europe, the unfathomable horrors of the Shoah. As a child, I watched the black and white movies of the camps. I spoke with survivors. I had nightmares about it. And yet, I didn't live through it. And the world's hatred for Jews and for Israel was not at the forefront of my mind. It is now. When I think about Israel now, I cannot help but wrestle with the world's hatred for our people, and more specifically with the intense hatred of Jews found throughout the Middle East. In college, I learned about our historical role within Arab Muslim societies. We were dhimmis, second-class citizens. We were lower by law, and we were meant to feel it. In Kentucky, when I listened to a congregant's experience about growing up in Iraq, and when I read the memoir of a community member's father who grew up in Iran, I got a taste of what Jews in the region had experienced. Over the course of this past year, I have listened to more stories of our people who come from the Middle East by listening to AJC's wonderful, powerful podcast, The Forgotten Exodus. I highly recommend that we listen and learn from the experience of our siblings who grew up in those lands. What was it like as the hate became so intense that the region became Judenrein, emptied of all its Jews? Let us take a few minutes to remember this mass exodus of our siblings together. We'll start with Iraq. In 1941, the Farhud erupted in Iraq, in Baghdad. For 2 days, mobs killed, raped, and mutilated our people. From 1951 to 1952, Israel helped the Jews of Iraq escape. Over 120,000 Jews fled Iraq, 90% of the Jewish population. In the end, the 10% that stayed also had to flee. And Iraq finally became Judenrein, emptied of all its Jews. In Yemen, we also faced mob violence. In 1947, just days after the UN vote to partition Palestine and create a Jewish state, mobs attacked Jewish homes and businesses in Aden. Al-Kanfei Nisharim, on eagle's wings, with over 380 Alaska Airlines flights. Almost all of Yemen's 50,000 Jews fled and came to the land of Israel. In 2021, Houthi rebels, backed by Iran, expelled the last 3 Jewish families, and Yemen became Judenrein, emptied of all its Jews. In Egypt, there had actually been a glimmer of hope. During the 1919 movement for independence, there were calls for coexistence and pluralism. But then, with the rise of nationalism, old hatreds reemerged. Egypt should be for Egyptians, not for foreigners, they said. By the middle of the 20th century, the anti-Semitism was so intense that Egypt's 80,000 Jews fled. And in the end, Egypt also became Judenrein, emptied of all its Jews. In Libya, the Jews were known for celebrating 3 Purims, the traditional one, and 2 other celebrations for having survived 2 additional attempts to destroy them. In 1945, mobs murdered Jews once again. Nationalism was mixed with anti-Semitism. There were repeated calls to destroy the Zionist enemy, and that meant that none of the Jews of Libya were safe. The 40,000 Jews of Libya fled, and Libya also became Judenrein, emptied of all its Jews. In Sudan, there were also rampant conspiracies about Zionist spies and Zionist plots, with mobs chanting, "Itbach, Itbach al-Yahud," slaughter, slaughter the Jews. The Jews of Sudan knew they must flee, and Sudan became Judenrein, emptied of all its Jews. In Syria, following the 1947 UN vote on partition, synagogues were set ablaze, Jewish homes burned, and businesses were looted. The Jewish community fled, and Syria also became Judenrein, emptied of all its Jews. In Tunisia, attacks on the Jewish community similarly resulted in the fleeing of its more than 100,000 Jews, and Tunisia became Judenrein, emptied of all its Jews. And finally, I will speak about Iran. With the rise of Shia Islam in the 16th century, Jews were forced to live in ghettos called mahalleh, or to wear yellow stars and special shoes. Jews in Iran were called najes. They were considered impure and untouchable. I highly recommend Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, and the subsequent movie, Origin. Wilkerson highlights how a caste system was used in America to subjugate and control black people. She also notes how caste systems have been used in India to oppress Dalits, and by the Nazis to subjugate and destroy our people. In our country, black people were often prohibited from swimming in a public pool for fear that they would make the water impure for whites. Similarly, in Iran, when it rained, Jews were not allowed to leave the Jewish ghetto, the mahalleh, because the water that trickled off them would surely pollute the water system. When Mohammad Reza Pahlavi became Shah in 1941, things got much better for the Jewish community. For a couple decades, Iran was an oasis in the Middle East, a modern country with even decent relationships with Israel. As you know, all that changed with Khomeini's Islamic Revolution in 1979. Khomeini would say, "I am not against Jews, I'm against Zionists." But similar to segregation in the United States, Jews were suddenly only allowed to use specific water fountains and bathrooms. Once more, we had become najes, impure and untouchable. About 90,000 Jews were able to flee Iran, but some 10,000 Jews remain trapped. They live in submission, careful to not upset the regime. Certainly, they may not express any support for Israel. Zionism is punishable by death. The reason that I take this time to remember our great expulsion from Arab lands is because it is vital for us to understand the hatred of Jews that flows throughout the Middle East. We have experienced living as dhimmis, as second-class citizens, and this is not something that we ever wish to return to. That caste system is still an integral part of the culture of the Middle East. From the perspective of that caste system, we were never supposed to lift our heads, let alone create a country of our own. This is crucial to understanding why the mere existence of Israel is such an anathema and a threat to those in the Middle East. It threatens a caste system that is woven into the very fabric of the region. From a Western worldview, it can be difficult to grasp the hatred inherent in this Middle Eastern caste system. But a full understanding of the situation in the Middle East requires a recognition of the deep-seated hatred of Jews which underlies the antagonism toward Israel. This summer, I got a taste of it when reading Ayan Hirsi Ali's biography. She shares how from birth she had been inculcated with hate for Jews. She relates, "As a child in Somalia, I was a passive consumer of anti-Semitism. Things would break, conflicts would arise, shortages would occur, and adults would blame it all on the Jews. My mother would scream and curse under her breath, 'Yehud!' It wasn't just my mother. Grown-ups around me exclaimed, 'Yehud!' I was made to understand that Jews, Yehud, were all bad." It is this hatred that stands behind the absence of Jews across the Middle East, and it is this hatred that surrounds Israel. When some college students speak, often shout, about their imagined future for the land, I fret for what they have in mind. From the river to the sea, what would that be like for our people? There are no democracies in the region, and we should not expect equal treatment under the law. Dhimmis don't get that. Sadly, even amidst glimmers of hope, when there are agreements for peace or agreements to work together, like the Abraham Accords, the regular citizens of those countries often want to break the agreements due to their hatred for Jews. It can be difficult to grasp this. We want there to be peace, and we want to believe that everyone wants peace. However, the ADL's research has shown that a tremendously high level of hatred for Jews has existed for decades across the Middle East. Let us remember that the desire to be free from hatred stood as the main motivating factor for the founders of modern Zionism. It turns out that Theodor Herzl did not become the father of Zionism because of his zeal for Judaism or his love of Tanakh. Rather, he became the father of Zionism because he recognized that the hatred of the nations meant that we needed a country of our own in order to be a free people. And yet, is Israel truly free today? Are we, as we hope for in Hatikva, an Am Chovshi Be'artzenu, a free people in our land? Sadly, my answer is no. No, not while our people are constantly besieged, fearful for our lives. That is not freedom. That was not the type of freedom that the prophet Micah spoke about when he said, "V'yashvu ish tachat gafno v'tachat te'enato ve'en macharid." Each person shall sit under their vine or under their fig tree with none to make them afraid. For all our success in creating Israel, we are not yet a free people in our land. We were not free in 1929 when Jews were massacred in Hebron. And we were not free in 1941 when Hajj Amin al-Husseini met with Hitler, sharing their desire to murder Jews. We were not free in 1948 when Israel was attacked on all sides. And we were not free in 1967 when there were calls to push all the Jews into the sea. We were not free during the many years of terrorist attacks And we were certainly not free during the devastating attacks of October 7th. Sadly, today we are still not a free people in our land. So when I sing Hatikva during services, I am not simply singing it as a national anthem. I am singing it as a prayer that comes from deep within my Jewish heart, Liot am chovshi be'artzenu, to be a free people in our land. And because it is sung as a prayer, it is absolutely appropriate for services. My hope is that all of us will sing Hatikva from a place of prayer, from a place of hope, from a place of longing to be a free people in our land. This year, let us rise above the hate. Let us be proud of who we are. Let us continue the work of generations past to make this dream, this prayer, this hope to be a free people into a reality. Let our people go free, and let a great peace embrace the entire world. Please rise and join me now for the singing of Hatikva. Koholod balevav penima nefesh Yehudi homiha ulfateh mizrach kahadima Ein Letzion Tzofiha Od lo avda tikvatenu Hatikva bat shnot alpayim Liot am chovshi be'artzenu Eretz Zion v'Yerushalayim Liot am chovshi be'artzenu Eretz Zion v'Yerushalayim. Thank you and good Yom Tov. Thank you. We may be seated.